welcoming my colleague and most importantly my friend, CNN's Chief Medical Correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Thank you.
This is really great because Erica's forced to say nice things about me.
I am, and it's being recorded, so you're going to be able to prove that I actually said these things. It's easy to do with Sanjay, it really is. So for a lot of people, they may know you from television, but you are still actively practicing. You're a surgeon. We know that on Mondays you're generally not available at CNN because you're in surgery. So you lead this double life. When someone asks you what you do, what do you answer first?
I'm a doctor. I think I'm a doctor, certainly a doctor first. I think part of that is just that medicine was my first and truest love. I've been thinking about medicine since I was a teenager. So I see that still as what I do. And it's funny, still I think I've been doing this sort of bifurcated career now for 18 years, and I think my wife and my parents still that TV thing that you do. It's that other thing, so. But obviously, I treasure this part of my life a lot, and I think I have the best job in the world for me.
You started at CNN in 2001. How did you end up there?
It's interesting, and I got to point out Keith McAllister's here, who I don't know if people know Keith, but Keith was actually one of the guys who hired me at the time. It was interesting. I started in August of 2001, and my background, in addition to practicing medicine, I was writing a lot about healthcare policy. I thought medical people should be involved in the healthcare policy discussion. I worked at the White House for a while on healthcare policy issues. Around the same time, Gina McCarthy was at the White House. And there's sort of a porous border, I think, in many ways, between public service and journalism. People go back and forth a bit. And there was, some desire to amp up the medical coverage at CNN, and specifically talk a lot about healthcare policy. That was August of 2001, and 3.5 weeks after I started, the attacks of 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, that's obviously everyone's life is changed, mine, yours, everybody's. And I think it may have been Keith or somebody else who said, we're probably not going to be reporting on health policy for a while, but now you're a doctor working at an international news network in the middle of what is happening, you should cover some of these stories about people who neither lived nor died here in New York City, about anthrax attacks going into Afghanistan and Iraq. Those are always things that I was interested in, but now it was unfolding in real time.
And how do you, when you end up in a lot of these situations, specifically when you end up in a war zone, or if you are in the aftermath of a disaster on more than one occasion, you have been there with CNN as a journalist, and yet you end up putting on your doctor hat. How do you make that choice? When to step in?
Erica, it's. I never thought of it as a hard choice. Initially, I think, especially given the background when I started working here, I mean, medicine and neurosurgery was my entire life. The first time it really happened, I was over in Iraq, and I was an embedded reporter. And when you're an embedded reporter, it was the first time they really had an embedding process. You live and do everything with a group of people for a period of time, and there's really tough situations that you're in together. A lot of times you take care of each other. You get to know everything about each other, your families, everything. And they knew I was a neurosurgeon, and we were outside of Baghdad, and they're a lieutenant who I also knew before he got shot in the head. He was shot by a sniper, and I remember being in the tent still with a guy named Captain John Percivali. It's 16 years ago, some things you never forget. And this other lieutenant named Mike Bolello came running into the tent and said, hey, this other lieutenant's been shot in the head, and, can you come take a look? Can you literally take off your journalist cap, put on your surgeon's cap? Because there were no neurosurgeons in that particular area at the time. So that was an obvious, thing to do. I mean, and it was an honor to do it. And, you go and in this case, I ended up operating on Jesus Vidania, and he ended up, he had a bad injury, but he did well. We were able to do the operation that needed to be done in that dusty desert tent. I think what surprised me was the aftermath of that a bit. We didn't report on it. There had been BBC was in the area, they reported on it, and then after they reported on it, of course, we were asked to sort of talk about what had happened, and I got a fair amount of blowback on that, and the concern was, and this was the real inflection point between medicine and media for me, was did you cross a line journalistically? Did you become too close to, in this case, the people that you're reporting with, reporting on? And of course, I didn't see it that way, and I don't think putting a press badge on is some bar to your humanity in some way, And I think that anybody, like if you were in a situation where all of a sudden you were the first person there, and oftentimes we are as journalists, and something terrible was unfolding, hopefully you'd put your camera down and go help the person, because that's what, I think that's what our human instinct is to do. But, I learned a lot from that episode, but it's happened many times since then, because we are often the first, and neurosurgery is not often a skill set that, is available in these situations. So Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, Nepal, all these places, that confluence has often happened.
To that too, based on that first event, did it change what you bring with you when you travel?
It's interesting. That first event, this may be more detail than you want for lunchtime conversation, but we didn't have a lot of equipment. We're literally in these tents in the middle of a war zone, and all of a sudden I'm getting asked to perform a procedure for which there is no equipment. So I literally took the Black & Decker drill and sterilized the tip, in the sterilizing fluid, and used that to essentially remove bone. You got to decompress the brain. That's the goal of the operation at that point. Remove bone and bullet fragments, but take the pressure off the brain. So I wish that I had a proper drill, although we were able to get done what we needed to get done there. I take a pretty good trauma sort of kit with me where I go. I don't take a drill, but I do take a lot of other things with me. It's not too different than I think what a lot of other war zone reporters take. And I make it clear, in a lot of these places, there is medical infrastructure in place. I'm not trying to in some way supplant that medical infrastructure. You cover big stories, and there's great doctors and nurses and medical professionals in these places that are doing work. But in the situation where they need someone like me, then of course, then I step in.
You also have this, you have this unique lens too, being a practicing surgeon and being a journalist at the same time. You do see things slightly differently. Yeah. That's colored not just by your medical experience, but also, by your time in the field as a journalist. Based on what you've seen over the last 18 years or so, as you've been going to disasters, whether they're natural disasters or war zones, have you noticed a change in the way health is being approached and the way even disaster relief or preparedness is being approached?
Yes, I think there's absolutely been some significant changes. I think, first of all, it's become a thing, like in the sense that, I think it was very binary before, event happens, some relief comes in, there's this venting of compassion, as I called it, where all of a sudden, 10,000 Tommy Hilfiger t-shirts will show up the next day, or something like that. But it wasn't necessarily long-term, nor was it necessarily always well thought out in terms of what that relief would look like. I think so from a just sort of infrastructure standpoint, the idea of investing in things longer term. So after a tsunami in South Asia, it's the old adage, you can give someone a fish or you can teach them to fish, and how do you actually build that infrastructure long term with all this vented compassion that has come out in the form of resources and money and things like that. That's been a good strategic shift. I also think that things like mental health weren't really part of the discussion, at least not nearly 20 years ago when I started. I'm sure it was part of the discussion for some organizations, maybe this one, but from a sort of reporting standpoint, you didn't see it as much. But then over the last few years, out in Congo, covering some of the tragedies out there, and one of the stories we ended up doing were regarding these children who were given these coloring books that were instructional for them. Not only was it cathartic for them to be able to sit there with pen and paper and actually do something, but what they were learning through that in terms of their own mental health healing was objectively making a difference. And that's the kind of thing that I don't think people gave as much thought to, I think, in the past. So those types of things are changing. And I think it's also, there's a lot more interest in this. My young medical students, and they come to me and talk as much about wanting to be out in the field and doing the sort of work that organizations like Americares and other organizations do as they talk about neurosurgery. I think there's a real enthusiasm around it.
You bring up 2 points that I just want to drill down on a little bit. You talk about mental health. We just had a phenomenal panel right before lunch, specifically addressing mental health. And one of the things that was talked about was not only reducing the stigma, which I know was a real effort, obviously, in this country and in others, but also the importance of listening, which we heard you say right at the end of that video, that you're there and you're there to listen. And that's something that we all sometimes forget to do. But I know as journalists, that's something we try to do all the time, because the more you listen, people just talk, and so much comes out.
Yes. And
there's also a respect that comes with the listening too.
Absolutely. It's interesting. There's this metaphor that I've thought of several years ago. When you're exercising, people talk about how many reps you do when you exercise, right? Which is kind of the wrong way to think about it. You should really count the number of reps that you're doing after it starts to hurt, because that's when you're actually transforming yourself in some way. Before that, it's just it's like cardio before that, And I think when you're interviewing people in the field, especially you got cameras around, and it's for a lot of people who've never been on camera, it's such a intimidating experience that I kind of feel like the first while, 15 minutes, 30 minutes of them talking usually is like the beginning of the workout. When I just sort of step back and just let them continue to talk, which you do so well, when they get to that point, you can tell when they're now starting to share, they've eased into it, and they're able to actually tell their story in a way that is meaningful for the viewer, but also for the person who's telling the story. They're doing it for a reason. They're oftentimes describing something that's very tragic in their lives. And I have often thought to myself, I don't know that I could do that if I were in that same situation. Could I talk about my child that I just lost or whatever's just happened? And yet they do it because they want people to know what's happening there, and in some way they want to pay respect to the person they just lost. And you've got to let that happen. It's the most meaningful part, I think, of the job. And in some ways it's the easiest because you just don't talk. you just listen and let them say what they're going to say.
You've tackled a lot of different topics. And I just noticed, I actually just noticed this the other day, so I was watching CNN. And we had a promo on for this phenomenal series that we do every year called Champions for Change. And this year, anchors and correspondents are highlighting people who they've covered in the past who've really made a difference on them. And there's a clip of you and a gentleman, and you were standing on the Golden Gate Bridge. And I have honestly chills thinking about this moment. And in the promo, you say to him, "This is where I jumped." And he looks at you and he says, "This is where I lived." To be able to share his story, to be able to bring awareness back to his story again at this point, that's a really powerful moment for him, but also for you.
Yeah. This is the story of a guy named Kevin Hines, and it was one of the first stories I did at CNN, and it's a story of a guy, 19 years old at the time, who went to what was at the time the number one, believe it or not, suicide spot in the country, the Golden Gate Bridge, people jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he jumped. And most people, as you might imagine, don't survive, but he did. And it was just a story that, there was so many layers to the story for me in terms of who he was, what was going on in his life, what the people around him, what was happening in their lives, all of that. And so I wanted to revisit that story and first of all, see how he was doing, see the impact that he's now made in other people's lives as a result of this experience. He's dedicated his whole life to suicide and suicide prevention. He's dedicated his life to getting a net put in on the Golden Gate Bridge to try and help people like him who are thinking about jumping, thinking about dying by suicide. One of the things about Kevin that always stuck with me, and the real reason I wanted to revisit him, is he said on the day that he decided to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, he made a pact with himself. He left his house, walked to the bus stop, took the bus to the Golden Gate Bridge, walked about another quarter mile to where he decided he was going to jump. And he basically said, if a single person smiles at me or shows me an act of kindness, I won't do it. And he left this note in his apartment at his house, and his family saw this after the fact and realized that he did it, so that an entire, whatever, nearly 2-hour journey that it took him to get there, not a single person smiled at him or showed him kindness, and he was very upset. He was crying. He was clearly unhappy and upset, and that just really stuck with me. Like, if you see someone drop of a cardiac arrest right now, you kind of know what to do, hopefully, most of us. You call 911, you start pumping on the chest, you can save that person. Someone is clearly in mental health crisis, clearly, and everyone knows it. Not only do most people not help, most people, as it turns out, turn away. And I think that it was that part of the story that I thought I really wanted to return to. Where are we? Suicides in this country have gone up 30% over the last 20 years. Life expectancy in the United States has dropped now 3 years in a row, in part driven by suicides, drug overdoses, liver cirrhosis due to alcoholism, these deaths of despair. What's happening? And this is unique to the United States. What's happening in the United States, and what can we do about it? Because I think there's some real solutions, and guys like Kevin are a part of that.
And sharing their story is a part of that. Tia, who said earlier this morning, she said, if the struggle isn't yours, it's invisible. And I think that goes to whether it touches you in society, right? Whether, well, that's an awful thing that's happening to that person, but it's not really on me, and what can I do? Or whether it's, I can't see it because it's inside. That's right.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And, but even I think in situations where you can see it, I mean, you can sense it. It's not someone dropping of a cardiac arrest, but clearly we all see people who probably are lonely, who are isolated, who are at real risk, and we don't take the time to say hello or reach out, and that's an easy thing to do. I mean, just saying hello in some ways is chest compressions on someone who really needs it at the time that you're offering that greeting. And again, that's one of the things I really wanted to convey with his story, and it's beneficial for him, but I think it's also beneficial for the hello giver as well, because we're all social creatures and we need that social fabric. I think that's what ultimately buffers us against some of these tragic trends.
Yeah, especially as we were talking to in the mental health panel. I think, Glenn, you were talking about the rise in loneliness. Right, and that I think the statistic was 40% of Americans now say they feel lonely, that they need, they need that community. So one of the things in your new series, Chasing Life, which is, as I told you, next time I'm available. I'll carry the bags. I'll do whatever you need, because you get to travel the world and learn all these great things. One of the things I think it was India, and you said it changed the way that you talked about health. So before it was more of a fear tactic of,
yes.
You have to work out and you have to eat these things and you have to sleep because otherwise it's just gonna ruin you. And instead it was, well, it's about feeling good and embracing it, being healthy is a good thing.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit how that changed your approach when you're talking with patients or other people.
I really appreciate that you actually watched the show. I can tell now.
I mean, I'm your number one fan. I have to.
Right.
No, it is fantastic.
It's nothing like this on the set, by the way. She's unbearable on the set.
She's a nightmare.
I think fear-based motivation just isn't a very good approach for just about anything. I think there's a neuroscience reason as to why it's not good. When you appeal to fear, you're appealing directly to this area of the brain known as the amygdala, which is sort of your emotional center of the brain. And when you scare someone in this way, you say, if you eat that, you will have a heart attack. If you do that, you will get cancer. You will get a hot and immediate response from the amygdala, and it will translate into action. But when it translates into action, it oftentimes bypasses the executive functioning areas of the brain, the frontal lobes. So you get this very uncoordinated, non-strategic sort of action that typically doesn't last very long. It's, person starts dieting intensely for a week, but then is right back to the same thing. So in terms of actually motivating people for longer standing changes in their lives, I think really reminding them of what good can come of it, how their lives will change because of it. It's tough, because if I tell you, hey, you eat right, you exercise, engage in healthy behaviors, nothing will happen to you. That's not the most inspiring message. But if I can commingle this idea of doing these healthy things and you being happier, healthier, more productive, a better wife, a better mom, a better coworker, whatever it may be, that ends up being a much more inspiring and I think and lasting message in terms of response. So I got that, in India you see a lot of that. the health and happiness are frictionless in terms of how they mix with each other. I eat this way because it makes me happy, because I feel better, I can act better, all these types of things. That's part of the constant conversation in terms of not disentangling health and happiness.
So when you started at CNN, you thought you'd be covering a little bit more health policy.
Right.
Not that there isn't health policy that is still talked about, obviously.
We still cover it, too.
We do still cover it. It still needs work, as we all know. What have you learned? I mean, it's tough to boil it down, I know, in 18 years, but like in merging these two worlds, what has surprised you the most about where they can come together and what you can learn from each?
I think there's a tremendous desire for people to get health knowledge. I think that people want this sort of knowledge. I think that there's been a couple things that have happened along the way, and I think you have seen, sadly, an erosion of trust in mainstream medicine, and because of that, or maybe sort of running parallel with that, there's been an increased sort of desire for getting health knowledge in other places. I think one of the jobs, and this surprised me a little bit, I think for me was making sure that the health knowledge that's out there is not bad knowledge, which is a big task, really. I mean, of course you want to get really good knowledge out there, but in some ways you have to spend a fair amount of time batting down the bad knowledge as well, in order to make sure that what people are hearing is not going to misinform them or lead them down some bad path for themselves or their loved ones. I think the other thing that surprised me is I knew that I was coming as a doctor to journalism, and that my medical background would hopefully help inform my reporting, just, whether it's something very specific within medicine or things that are happening within hospitals or the policy of health as a whole. But I think the reverse ended up also being true, and that surprised me in a good way. Journalists, they're investigators, they're storytellers. They pay attention to the gray in between the black and white. The nuance is not lost on good journalists. And I think in the medical world, oftentimes, it does, it's a process where you're seeing a specific problem with the patient. It's boiled down to L5-S1 disc causing leg pain, and I remember at some point it sort of clicked for me that I go in to see patients in the office, and it almost became like, I was more the journalist than I was the doctor. So tell me about yourself. So you were fly fishing when this happened. How long have you been fly fishing? So your boots got stuck in the mud, and the water was rising, then what happened, And I'll never forget that patient, right? After you hear those stories, it's the best kind of learning, in a way, to impregnate those lessons within stories, as as I think most people know, but I had never really been taught that. It's much more didactic in medicine. It's very scientific, and you literally have an abstract, you have a conclusion, and you're drawing that. That's how you sort of craft your whole life. And here I got to pay attention to the nuance. Drove my residents and medical students crazy, right? Because I'd spend all this time with patients, and we're talking about fly fishing, and they're like, what time are you planning on getting out of here, doc? But I enjoyed it, and I think so. I've probably enjoyed medicine more in some ways now that I straddle than I would have if I just did it by itself.
And you must really enjoy having that. I know we're short on time, but just having that ability to have a voice too, to get that message out, whether it's about suicide prevention, whether it's about health policy, how to tackle a disaster, but you have a really powerful and important platform.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I treasure it. I consider it a real privilege. I do anything not to destroy that in some way. You want to make sure that you constantly earn the trust of the viewers, and a lot of times that means saying I don't know when I don't know, but I'll get back to you. I'll learn about this, and I think there's some really important issues going on that are inflection points, between individual health and public health right now, with measles, for example, here in New York City and Rockland County, and these are important times, to make sure that messaging around that and the stories that we tell around that are doing what they should be doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. Thanks for being you. You are, truly, he is He's a great reporter, doctor, but he is a phenomenal person. So.
Thank you. And our kids are getting married, by the way.
They are.
Yes.
But now that we've announced it publicly,
We've announced it
they're
publicly.
going to really love us for this.
We decided this before we had children, so that's...
I think it's when Rebecca and I were both pregnant, and we decided in the makeup room.
That's right.
That our kids were going to get married.
It's an arranged marriage. Indians do this sort of thing.
And we're all on board. So there you go. We'll let you know when the blessed event is.
Thank you.
Thank you.